One of the arguments that Sophia Roon pushed, which of course the skeptical heretic parroted, much like he parroted Evogen and Lithided Man's definition of heritability, is that you have to identify the effects of specific genes in order to make heritability estimates. This is wrong, and I argued at length why this is wrong, but failing argumentation, I decided to actually ask some experts. So I contacted 12 researchers, and so far, 2 have replied back, and they seem rather annoyed. I asked them all the same question, so I'll just read the question, and then I'll read their answers. So here is the question I asked all of them. In order to make meaningful heritability estimates, must one identify the specific genetic mechanisms for either between-group or within-group estimates? I understand the great fear of your statements being extended beyond what you narrowly said. I will simply report this question verbatim and in full, and your response verbatim and in full, should you choose to answer. Thank you for your valuable time. And the first response from Wendy Johnson, she says, Hi, Ryan. I don't know who you are or why you ask, but you can open any genetics textbook anywhere and learn that you do not need to know anything about specific genes in order to make heritability estimates. They are quantitative assessments of aggregate genetic influences only, and were made long before any genes had been identified at all. Wendy Johnson. All right, the next response was by Sharon Cardia. She says, Stephen. I use multiple names on the internet. She says, Stephen, heritability belongs to a group of statistical genetic measures that were developed 100 years ago when there were no measured genes and people knew very little about the mechanisms of heredity. It uses the correlation between relatives in their trait, like height, the fraction of genes that the relatives share, e.g., sibs share 1/2, in order to partition the variability in the trait into genetic and non-genetic components. There is no explicit genetic mechanism assumed, except Mendelian segregation of genes from parents to kids through meiosis. Hope that helps. Sharon. Okay. I've sent many to many other people. Jelt Wicharts hasn't responded yet. Henry Harpending hasn't responded yet. Razib Khan hasn't responded, and I don't think he will, because Razib Khan, who isn't a botanist like Sophia Roon, but is actually a real geneticist, actually wrote an article on this topic. And the article was entitled, You Don't Need Genes for Genetics, in which he takes aim at this persistent and very kind of nasty myth that you need to find the specific genes in order to make heritability estimates. Okay, and I'll go ahead and link to that article there, right? Because Razib Khan has been getting a bunch of idiots in his comment section saying that you got to find the genes, and he's saying, no, ass clowns, you don't. All right. I'll be updating the description of this video if and as more of these experts respond to my query, but I am confident that they will all give the same answers as these two and Razib Khan has. Okay, this is an idiotic non-issue, right? Similar to the quote-unquote debate about Lithided Man's ass-word definition of heritability, which Evogen pushed out. And so it's been ascribed to Evogen, but Evogen got it from his mentor, i.e. Lithided Man. And another thing I want to point out is that this was a point on which the Skeptical Heretic supposedly won the live debate with me on. Right? He kept saying that you have to find the specific genetic mechanisms in order to make heritability estimates, and that I could not was evidence that I was wrong. Right? But this is a methodological error on his part, on Sophia Roon's part. Right? Sophia Roon, who is not a real geneticist, but is a botanist. Right? And as a botanist, you don't deal with heritability estimates of traits within populations or between populations. Okay, what you do with flowers and most animals, right, is you look at genes and you look at gene correlates, and because the differences are big enough that the specific genetic effects or the genome-wide association correlations are big enough that you can find them. Right, and so you don't need to do things like heritability estimates by controlling environment or teasing out environmental effects. Right, you don't have to make heritability estimates in the way psychologists do with humans. Right, and you don't do that. And so Sophia Roon doesn't have formal experience with it. Any knowledge that Sophia Roon has on making heritability estimates is self-taught, just like with me. Right, she's an autodidact. So am I. Okay, she is not a real psychologist. She does not like, I mean, she has some, I'm sure she has some, took some genetics classes, but to what extent those genetics classes dealt more than just the basic rudiments of making heritability estimates is debatable, right? She's not a real geneticist, okay? And the reason I contacted real experts is not because I had any difficulty understanding this, but because pig-brained YouTube atheists only respond to authority and political correctness. Now, this is a diversion here, or tangent. What is politically correct is not quite as one-dimensional as you might think. For example, feminism and old-style Marxism are not politically correct at this point. So political correctness is not a synonym for left-wing. All right. Anyway, identifying specific genes don't aid in heritability estimates unless the trait in question is monogenic or the variance in the trait is attributable to variance in a very small number of genes. Meaning that by identifying the impact of a few alleles or allele combinations or whatever else, you will explain a large proportion of the observed variance either within groups, between groups, or both. Okay, but with something like height or IQ, the allele frequencies that explain the observed variance encompass thousands of genes and their interactions. Okay, it's highly polygenic. But the criticism goes deeper than that, because even if the variance in a trait is explained by the variance in only a few genes, that itself has to be inferred. All right? This isn't Star Trek. Genes don't come with labels for what they do. So if you want to infer causation and not just correlation between having certain alleles and having certain phenotypes, you have to control for environment, or you have to tease out environment, and you have to control for other candidate genes. Or for group differences, you have to do things like subtest heritability analysis for IQ. So to infer the effects of a gene or some genetic co-evolved complex, you have to do the same kind of controls that you would do with making aggregate heritability estimates. Okay, the kind of heritability estimates that don't involve pinpointing genes. But instead of inferring an aggregate effect, you're inferring the effect of a specific gene or complex of genes. Okay, it's the exact same problem from an inferential standpoint. It's just, in fact, it's even harder. And most of the time, finding the effects of specific genes or gene complexes doesn't even aid in general heritability estimates, right? Get that through your head. Pinpointing specific genes does not aid in general heritability estimates either within group or between group most of the time. And I'm going to use an analogy to explain this. Now, for you pig-brained YouTube atheists who like to dismiss analogies because analogies aren't the same thing or they don't map 100%, right? The reason I'm using analogies for you is remedial, right? It's like mama bird chewing food so the babies can digest it. Okay, if you're looking at a forest, it's easier to estimate the number of trees over 10 square kilometers than it is to estimate the number of trees over a square meter. Okay, this is because over any given square meter, the number of trees is going to vary wildly. However, over an entire forest, you can more accurately estimate the number of trees if the area is large than if it is small for any given accuracy of your starting assumptions. Okay. Similarly, it is easier to estimate the heritability of a trait in regards to whole genomic aggregates than it is to pinpoint the effects of specific genes. Right? Because specific genes, they're confounded by the effects of the other genes. Doing an aggregate heritability estimate doesn't face the problem of the confounding effects of other genes because the aggregate effects of all of those genes are already taken into account by definition. Right? Do you see how this works? So what we are seeing is that the real researchers recognize that you don't have to identify the specific mechanisms in order to infer heritability. Real psychologists and real geneticists agree. Sophia Roon is a botanist. Hannibal Barca had one more semester of college than I do. Okay, in fact, I'm actually farther along in the bio series than Evogen. Right? Surprise, surprise. And that was after my one semester of college. Okay. Remember when I was saying that Evogen was full of shit and was just source flooding and 90% of his videos were completely irrelevant? Right? That it was just a bunch of pop genetics theory that had nothing to do with what was actually argued about? And remember, atheist cultists were saying that Evogen pwned me even though they couldn't replicate a single one of his arguments? Right? And of course their defense mechanism now is that I was pwned by someone without even any credentials. Okay? Right? Here's what the atheist cultists, they do this. I don't know exactly how Evogen pwned you, but he is a real biologist and is saying sciencey sounding things that I don't understand, but since it's against racism, I'm going to assume it's true. Then reality comes in and says, Evogen is a fraud and a turd with less scientific education at 30 than fringe elements had at 19. Then atheist cultists respond, oh, well that just means that fringe elements was being pwned by a scientific illiterate. Even more humiliating. Ho ho ho! Right? That's their defense mechanism. Right? Or we can look at the whole heritability debacle, which was spearheaded by Evogen, whose mentor was Lithodin Man, whose coattails were ridden by the anti-heretic. Okay, and the last thing I would like to add is that this false idea, pushed by both Sophia Rune and the anti-heretic, and Lithodin Man and Evogen, but that really goes without saying, was treated as a point on which the anti-heretic pwned me in the debate a year and a half ago. And given the regularity by which creationists win live debates with prominent evolutionists, one would think that the YouTube atheist would be a bit more wary about treating the results of a live debate as some sort of referendum on their position, lest they run the risk of forging a rod for their own back. Okay? The anti-heretic claims there is a pattern. Well, I see a pattern of atheist cultists taking textbook, inarguably wrong methodological positions and being corrected by real experts on them. And then throwing tantrums and psychologizing the opposition. Oh, I'm a self-hating faggot or whatever, and referencing the results of a live, unmoderated debate from a year and a half ago where one side got 80% of the speaking time. You atheist cultists are a fucking joke.